Welcome to another episode of Vetted with Mark Vetter. And today we get to talk to Chester Wisniewski, who's the CISO of a security leader, Sophos. And that's a lot of letters and a lot of weird words. So, Chet, can you tell us kind of what you do and how you got there?
Sure. I lead our global field CISO team, so I work directly for our CISO within Sophos, and obviously, being one of a large private security company, defending Sophos is rather a large challenge, and my team is one part of the group of people responsible for helping defend us against threats, in addition to obviously looking after our customer security and how they can best protect themselves. So the way I kind of phrase up what my team within Sophos does is we are sort of an interface between our group that does all of our research, which we call Sophos XOps team, which is about 1,000 people, including our analysts, malware analysts, web threat analysts, email specialists, AI and data scientists, all the folks that are responsible for processing all the threat intelligence to protect people, and sort of the outside world and who can take advantage of all that information to get a better picture of what the threat looks like so they can make good decisions about how to protect themselves. And that includes intelligence agencies, police, the media. We talk to magazines and newspapers and television frequently, and in addition to our customers and partners, so we can be sure they have what they need to make the important decisions on how to best protect themselves. And I guess for folks that aren't familiar with Sophos, I should just briefly say, we're a global computer security company. I've been around for just 40 years this year, actually. We've been around for a very long time. And we provide enterprise security products, but we don't do consumer stuff. So you won't see us on the shelf at Best Buy, but we do protect organizations around the world. And we're about 7,000 people. We're a pretty good sized company.
So, you're the company that we don't want to know anything about because you're protecting us without us knowing it.
Ideally, yeah, we certainly, it's one of those things that, I started out when we were a pretty small company. I've been in my job currently for 22 years. And so when I started, it was like, oh, that brand's protected by Sophos. You're proud of a certain brand and things. And now it's gotten to the point where it's like, we're a big enough company. We're protecting everybody in many small ways that they don't even realize every day, which is exciting, but it's also a lot of responsibility. Sometimes you realize that the decisions you're making when you're deciding how to give people advice or how you design your products in order to protect them, if you don't make good decisions, it's going to have an impact on the tens and hundreds of millions of people. It's a large responsibility to get it right.
Imagine a bad day is a really bad day.
Yeah, I mean, every security company's had one of those. I won't mention one of our primary competitors who had one about a year and a half ago, but um, we had one of those days myself about 10 years ago when we had a bad update go out to one of our products, and a day that you've disrupted tens of thousands of IT people and security people's lives because of a mistake you made is a pretty awful day. Um, but it also, in a way, I think it's important to understand the gravity and the scope of your responsibilities. Hopefully, not through making mistakes, but keeping that in mind all the time. The trust that's been placed in you and your colleagues by so many people is a really heavy responsibility, but it's also a point of pride. I mean, they're the people I work with are some of the smartest people working on these problems in the world, and the amount of data we're dealing with that help inform the decisions we make helps us make good decisions, right? Like, we ingest about 250 terabytes a day of threat intelligence information from firewalls and endpoint computers and things like that we protect around the world. And so having that data flowing in helps you make good decisions as well, and it also gives you a fantastic perspective of what's happening out there, which is why my team has so much fun communicating that to the world, right? Because it's like, who else has access to 250 terabytes of threat intelligence a day to figure out what's actually happening out there, as opposed to maybe what's in the headlines when you read an article in Ars Technica or Slashdot or something.
So, for the average person, we all have heard about malware. We all understand some of that and ransomware. But truly, what are the threats right now that are hitting the average American, Canadian, or even the average school district?
I
Where
think
are the primary threats?
Yeah, I think the threats have shifted quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, and that the majority of threats, when we're talking about malicious code and really large scale impact and damage is almost entirely targeting organizations rather than individuals. We don't really see criminals targeting personal devices that often with malware the way we might have 10, 20 years ago. And that isn't to say that there's not plenty of threats against the average person, but the average person mostly these days faces social threats, tricking you into giving up your credit card number, tricking you into giving up your password, tricking you into perhaps investing in an unwise cryptocurrency scheme or uh, these types of things, right? So they're real threats and they're still impacting millions and millions of Americans every year, but we're not really seeing it so much as a computer virus that gets on your PC that does some dastardly thing and to your device. And it's not to say those things don't exist, but it's lessened there. The criminals who have mastered the art of writing malware to target people are largely focusing on organizations where they can steal hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, rather than trying to go for an individual person $400 at a time. And so it kind of the social attacks are the small scale hundreds of dollars ones focusing on individuals, whereas the really damaging ones are focused more on organizations. And I guess that's the other big trend is away from viruses and worms and things like that the way we used to talk about them, and more towards social threats across the board. I mean, if you look at headlines the last few months as of the time that we're recording this, just before American Thanksgiving, uh, you've been hearing about all these organizations having their Salesforce data stolen, and all of those attacks ultimately stemmed from social engineering attacks. Tricking people into giving up credentials that allow criminals to log in rather than break in. And that's been another major shift in how we have to think about our strategy of defending ourselves, because it's not just about firewalls and antivirus the way it was. We now have to think about how our humans interact with these criminals and with our tools, and how we might accidentally surrender our own identities to the criminals, which is often where they're having success.
So if an organization I work with has an API and gives up some of my data to a vendor, which is then taken by a criminal, that gives them that input to get to my to social engineer me with greater efficiency, right?
That
So
and your family and colleagues potentially, right? If they want to impersonate you or imply that they know you, they have a bunch of information that's very useful.
so how do I ensure that the people who do own my data, is it even possible for me to say, if there's a breach, I must be notified? I mean, realistically, my data's out there. I know I can go to the dark web and I can learn about anything about myself that you may or may not want to know. Is there a way I can protect my own personal data before we get into the whole idea of an enterprise?
I don't like to be too defeatist on they already stole all my data, but they probably have. You're not wrong, but that doesn't mean it's not still worth trying to protect what you have,
Mhm.
and still being prudent as we move forward. I think we've all got a bit of breach notification fatigue. I mean, I've been told so many times that my information's
Right.
stolen that it doesn't have the emotional impact it did at one time. Um, One, I think you shouldn't surrender anything to someone that you don't need to, right? Think about that. So every time you sign up for a social media site, every time you do something, somebody's asking for your birth date. Your birth date, unfortunately, is a really important part of your identity. And is it really terrible if your friends get a notification on Facebook 10 days later that it's your birthday and they wish you a happy birthday instead of the day it actually is? It's one day a year you get to celebrate. Just pick one. It doesn't have to be the real one, or at least pick one that you share with social media that's perhaps not the real one. And you shouldn't feel obligated to tell the truth. And you should feel obligated to tell the truth when you're filling out a loan application, when you're filing your taxes. There are certain legal obligations you have to not falsify your identity, of course. But when we're being asked by a random website that you're signing up to a community forum about your favorite soccer team, it's really not their business what your birth date is or what your zip code or postal code is, depending where you live. And those things can be important parts of your identity. So I encourage people to not give up anything about themselves to entities that they're not required to give up that information. And then for proving your identity to loved ones, certainly, and perhaps even colleagues, I think we're getting to the point where we need to have a secret passphrase or a keyword that allows us to identify ourselves. So if our daughter calls up on the phone and says, "Dad, I'm at college and I'm broke and I really need you to send me 500 bucks, like everything's gone pear-shaped and I really need your help," She needs to remember that the magic password is, SpongeBob SquarePants, and that the criminal's not going to know that when they call you up to try to ask for the money. And certainly, I have an elderly mother, and that's something that I've had to coach her on, to go, if I need help, or if you need to have help, let's have a secret word that we can know for sure that we're talking to one another, so that in an emergency, when somebody's impersonating me and trying to, in a high stress situation, I'm in the hospital, I've been in a car accident, wire me some money. That's how these criminals try to emotionally exploit us. We need to have some way of verifying who we really are, because in the world of deep fakes and everything else, what nothing's what it appears to be anymore.
That's good advice for all of us. But when we start talking about enterprise organizations, let's talk about education in general. I was an educator for 40 years. Educators are wonderful, naive people who really, honestly, don't like change. They grew up in that 900 square foot classroom. They enjoyed sitting in straight rows. They enjoyed listening to a teacher. So they became one. And they don't think that the outside evil world's going to come get them. We all have our 911 moments, right? When the world changed for us. And with many of us educators, Columbine was it. But even after some of those physical threats that happened, schools didn't want to put in video doorbells. They didn't want to put in camera systems. Gosh, that's going to make us seem like a jail. I heard that so many times. So, as you're working with enterprise organizations, let's talk about schools in general, or public entities. How do you get them? How do you get my peers and my colleagues to truly understand the devious nature of the criminals who are coming after us and the value of the data that we hold? Sometimes I really don't think we understand the value of what we own in school districts.
Yeah, schools in particular can be challenging, right? Because you've been entrusted with children's identities, in addition to all the other information you collect as an organization, and as a public entity, you're also sort of the mindset that what you do should be public knowledge, and you've got this two-sided situation where you're trying to be open to the public and accountable to the public. At the same time, you're entrusted with incredibly sensitive information that you need to protect from the public and from criminals and from other entities. So it can be really I think one of the most important things with cybersecurity education, for sure, that I wish all organizations practice better, is it's more meaningful when the training is based around things that have actually happened to someone, instead of this generic slideware stuff that everybody has to do a half an hour of a year to meet some regulatory obligation. We've all sat through the monotonous video thing, the phishing training, and these types of things. And we had an executive of ours that was phished earlier this year, and we decided to publish a public blog on it, in addition to circulating it widely internally at the company, because we all know this individual. We've sat in all hands meetings. Many of us have had lunch or dinner with this person. It's much more impactful when you're like, wow, it could happen to them, right? Like, I know this person and they're really smart, and they fell for this thing. And I mean, if it could happen to them, it could happen to me. It just feels more real when it's not, I heard this on the news, or I read it in the newspaper, or I saw this thing, I guess newspaper, talking about being old fashioned, but um these generic trainings just feel um, like something you have to do and you slog through and you don't pay attention, like that boring class maybe when you when you were a kid in school and you weren't interested in mathematics and you just couldn't wait to get to music class. Um, and I think when it's about a colleague, a friend, a coworker, suddenly it has a deeper, more meaningful impact. So I think personalizing these things can help the training side of raising awareness. And I think in talking about incidents when they happen, and you start to realize that this is happening all the time, right? It was a teacher in the school district, or the school next door, or it was, you're at the grade school, and it was the principal at the middle school up the street. Talking about those things on a quarterly basis keeps it front of mind that this is happening all the time, because it is happening all the time. I mean, I would be shocked. Even the smallest, most rural school district in the world doesn't have multiple incidents every quarter of accounts being compromised, firewalls being breached, things that weren't patched getting exploited. And you don't want to paint this all as a whole bunch of failures, but you do need to paint it as This is something that's happening all the time. We have to stay vigilant because we have a big responsibility protecting our students.
And that's one of the frustrations I have is I had neighbor districts with very similar environments who had breaches, but their attorneys wouldn't let them talk to me about it. So even though I needed to protect my environment, we had similar environments. I didn't know what was going on next door unless I had a mole. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
That's a frustration. How can we get over that lack of sharing, which I understand legally and liability, but I also understand the need for us to band together to protect ourselves?
Well, I think one of the ways we've tried to work around this problem, I mean, clearly organizations are legally obligated to protect themselves, which means they often don't want to talk about these things. But these information sharing and analysis centers, ISACs, they're called. There's certainly one for um, education. There's one for retail. There's one for all these different sectors. And the idea is that CIOs, CTOs, CISOs of organizations can get together in an informal fashion and talk about these things with lawyers outside the room, generally Chatham House rules. So, you can't identify anybody in these meetings as an individual, but you can learn their stories and share their stories. And so that's one way that I see a lot of different sectors working around this. And I know there is an education ISAC in the United States that Canadian organizations also participate in. I know that EduCause provides similar forums within the education area for at least getting back to the storytelling so that you're hearing real stories from real victims about what happened and then what they did to plug those holes or the lessons they learned and takeaways without fear or risk of lawsuits and those types of things. So that can help. Uh, I mean, in many cases, when it's ransomware, there's no hiding this anymore. I mean, the school next door could pretend something didn't happen, but when school didn't open for 6 days and parents were, demanding answers from the superintendent at public meetings, it's quite clear whether they admit it or not what's going on. Unfortunately, because I mean that's one of the things. I mean, the majority of the attacks we're seeing today are intentionally disruptive as an extortion technique in order to try to extract money from the victims. And obviously, schools being closed means a lot of angry parents, and that the criminals are counting on those angry parents to help them leverage money out of that victim school district. And it's hard to sweep that under the carpet.
And my network engineers, my work 8 to 4, Monday through Friday. The attacks aren't happening 8 to 4, are they?
No, they're not. It was interesting and that I actually had to look it up a few weeks ago because I was curious. But I think 93% of attacks that we observed in 2024 occurred between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. Monday through Friday and or a weekend or a holiday. So almost all attacks are when you're not looking. And so 24/7 protection is a bare minimum table stakes, but most organizations are not going to have the staffing to do that, right? You probably need to be looking at outside services in order to cover that. But it's probably well worth the spend when you consider that even during the 8 to 4, it lowers the stress dramatically for the team to not be in firefighting mode worrying about what's trying to, storm the castle wall. The stress levels are pretty high amongst people that are responsible for security. I mean, the mental health concerns are real. We've been measuring that as well and trying to see. And I mean, it's upwards of 80% of people with full time security roles, in particular, struggling with some sort of mental health issue or stress issue from the workplace. It's not good. And so I think looking to outside help can help because I mean I've done the math a few times. If you were gonna run a 24/7 security operations center to defend something, you're gonna have a hard time doing that with less than 20 full-time staff. If you've gotta do it 24 hours a day and you've gotta have a few specialist roles and you've gotta be able to accommodate somebody leaving on maternity leave or paternity leave, or being sick with COVID or whatever the thing is of the week, to staff something like that is incredibly difficult. But unfortunately, the criminals are not waiting until business hours when you're sitting at the console to attack you.
And for school districts, even if we can afford a security person or 2, we can't pay them the salaries that private industry can. So we may get them started, train them up, get them proficient in what they do, and they're gone.
Yeah, that's always a challenge, especially when you're dealing with public sector salaries, right? It's the same thing we see with police departments and many other places. It's like, well, the better your training program is, the faster people leave.
So you brought up the spend that's necessary to reduce stress. Uh, about a month ago, I did a presentation, was just calling Pete, superintendent who's an old friend, and he has a gym that needs a new roof. And I asked him in a public setting in front of a couple hundred people, what are you spending to provide security for your network? He said, I have a choice. I'll take the risk with the network because I have to put the gym is leaking. I have to put a new roof on it. School leaders, public leaders, even private leaders are all facing those kinds of choices. I get the cost benefit analysis, but how do we help people understand that the damage that can be done is greater than just a few 100,000, or let's be honest, a million, $2 million that they could be out to recover from a major incident, but also in the lost data and lost trust to your community, the lost trust to your workers. How do we help leadership truly understand the necessity to deal with security upfront?
Yeah, it comes back to your previous question, I think, as far as the not hearing about your peers' victimhood to help you wake up to really understanding how serious and common these attacks really are. And certainly, it depends on the size of the organization, but I think the median attack in our data last year was 1.5 million, $2 million per incident. Clearly, it's less for really small organizations, but no school's a really small organization. The amount of data a school has is a high amount of data for the size of an organization that is compared to a private sector company. You think about, most businesses just have their employees to worry about, where a school has the employees plus the students, the faculty, staff, and the students, right? So, a whole ton of it, of incredibly sensitive information, including the financial information, of course, and all the teachers and things like that for their from their HR files, and not and health information that often most private organizations wouldn't be in possession of conditions of the students and things like that as well. It's a lot, and hopefully you would hope that that would be enough of a wake up call to realize how valuable that type of information can be to criminals, and certainly as a lever for extortion attacks that we see often. One way to deal with it for the administration, for the poor superintendent who has to try to figure out what to do about the leaky roof and the firewalls at the same time, is I think we focus too much on fancy threats, and maybe we need to double down on the basics, right? Like if you've got limited budget, spend as much of it as you can on getting the basics right. No different than, I mean, I'm not an educator, but it seems like the kind of thing I would want for my children if I had kids in school, which is I want them to get the basics right first, right? Like, got to do the reading, writing, and arithmetic, and then the rest we build on top of that incredibly stable, important foundation. And it's no different with security, right? We need to worry about primarily identity, patching, and firewalls as a starting point, because the criminals, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, like, they're logging in, they're not breaking in. So we need to focus on, well, how is it that they're breaching our defenses, and make sure that we're spending our time and money in those areas where it's most likely that we're going to have a failure, as opposed to trying to spread out that tiny budget across 150 different things, right? Like, I mean, there's a whole bunch of really cool, sexy tools out there that there's a guy calling you up on the phone to sell you every day. And unfortunately, on a school budget, you probably can't afford the cool, sexy tool. And AI is not going to solve all your problems. I hate to tell you. I know it's contrary to what that everything you've heard on television, perhaps, but AI is not the saving grace, and spending a whole bunch of money on it's unlikely to solve very many of your problems. What's going to solve the problems is a whole bunch of hard work on a bunch of really simple, basic building blocks of security.
It is one of the new trends over the next year I've been talking to all the districts about is they're reorganizing their data, where it's stored, how it's stored, to enable AI agents within their own districts. So instead of having all of our vendors control our data, which we've done for years because storage is expensive, so we'll let you store it. Now we're bringing it home. So it's adjacent, and we can start to build our own agents versus paying for an agent. Are there any tips for districts or agencies as they're bringing some of that data home to build it correctly and to protect it correctly?
It's a lot of responsibility to bring it back in house, because I mean, the one thing that certainly the major cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft and Google have crack security teams. And so while that doesn't make your data impervious to being stolen when it's stored in their facilities, there is a multi-thousand person 24/7 monitoring and protecting those systems. And when you bring that back in house, you're taking on a lot of responsibility for data security and encryption, and in particular with the AI side of it. Security protocols for most of these agentic AI systems are non-existent or poor. Like usual, we do the security after all the information's been stolen. We close the barn door behind the horses that have already escaped. Um, and we're in a similar position with AI, right? Like security is an afterthought, and at this point, we're at the very beginning of this cycle. It's security is just being introduced into a lot of these systems. In fact, one of the major protocol that you use for agentic AI is a server called an MCP server, and there wasn't even authentication as part of that protocol until June of 2025. So any system that was being presented information for agentic AI use was just free for all for whatever you wanted to do with any information it had. So we're really early days on the security and privacy aspects of the AI stuff. I would proceed with extreme caution. If you are bringing these things in house, clearly everything should be protected by phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. And that's a fancy way of saying either hardware tokens or passkeys, which is the kind of the new type of multi-factor authentication all security experts are recommending, where perhaps you have to unlock your iPhone with your face, or your phone with your fingerprint, or maybe the camera or thumbprint reader on your laptop as part of your authentication, in addition to knowing a PIN or a password or some other thing. So when we talk about multi-factor, it's really important to think that multi-factor is not two things you know, which is kind of unfortunately what we've been teaching people, right? We teach you that you get a 6-digit code when you log into your bank account, and you should add that with your password and send it to us so that we know it's you. That's two things you know. It's your password and the 6 digits I share with you. Two things you know is not multi-factor. So if you're going to bring this data back in-house, you have a responsibility to protect it. And the bare minimum table stakes should be anybody accessing it should have two actual factors: something they are and something they know, something they have and something they know, but not something they know and something they know. Because if it's two things you know, you can surrender both of them to a criminal, and now they're you. And that's, I think, a basic requirement. And obviously, legally, that information should be encrypted, of course, if it's in any way sensitive, if that data is coming back in house. And when I say encrypted, that means encrypted in transit while it's being transmitted, like we're used to with using HTTPS in our web browsers, but also when it's at rest. If that data is sitting on a hard drive, it should be protected there as well. Because too often we're also seeing these hard drives get decommissioned at the end of their life, and then somebody buys it on eBay and finds 200,000 student social security numbers on it because it wasn't stored in an encrypted fashion. And that's another way information's being lost or stolen.
Wow. I hadn't thought about the reuse nature of equipment that way. I'm laughing as you were talking about encrypted at rest. We had a major software vendor statewide, and I learned that it was a university that none of the behavioral data, which is extremely sensitive, IEPs, 504s, behavioral data, was encrypted at rest. And I refused to put our data on their servers. And boy, was I the whipping boy of every angry administrator in the world because I said no. It's a stance that we have to take, and we have to have data use agreements. Districts need to ask the hard questions, but for some reason we don't want to. There's resistance to asking the hard questions. Have you run into that?
Yeah, I mean, vendor onboarding should be the place where you catch these things, right? Like that's your opportunity, like you said, to say no before the data goes there, right? And probably everybody listening to this podcast was aware of the Power School breach last year. And here in Canada now, there's been repercussions for some of our public school institutions saying they were negligent because they didn't do their due diligence to understand that this organization was not protecting that data adequately to Canadian privacy standards, which it's the school's obligation You can't, that's not a transferable thing. You can't say, I hired this other company to do it. Now it's their responsibility. It doesn't work that way. You've been entrusted with the data. It is your responsibility. It doesn't matter where you put that data. You're responsible for protecting it. And if you're going to entrust it to a third party, it's your responsibility to ensure that third party meets your obligations. And if they don't, you're the one that's guilty of the crime.
I just want to pause right there because I think that's probably a perfect place to end the conversation, because that is a statement we all need to take to heart. And we need to take data governance and protecting data personally. And as a leader in education, as a leader of technology, that's something I tried. And I think that your message is wonderful for everybody to hear, that data is precious and we have to take it personally. So thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me on. I don't live entirely in education world, but unfortunately, folks in education are a disproportionate number of the organizations falling victim because of such strained resources. And I hope this helps some folks think about it a little more carefully.
Okay. Thank you, Chester. We appreciate it. And we appreciate your work with Sophos. Have a good day.
Cheers, you too.